Welcome everybody to this presentation. This is the next instalment of our Scope It study. We're going to be looking at contradictions that we see in our data coming out. So that's the full set of researchers. So in terms of the problem that we're particularly focusing, obviously focusing on teaching out of field, recognising it as a phenomenon, allocated to classes that are different to their training background, qualifications and expertise. And I'll just recognise that we don't have certification in Australia. It's very much either teachers are registered as teachers without any recognition of their specialisations, but in New South Wales, they do get accredited to teach in those subjects. So that's our context here in Australia. For our study, we're interested in the fact that we're yet to fully understand who's actually responsible for dealing with out-of-field teaching, what can be done to support out-of-field teachers, and how can support be provided in this particular time of teacher shortage. So just to identify that teacher shortage, you can see in Australia with that green dot there, we've got relatively high teacher shortages, not the most, but still amongst the highest number of teacher shortages currently experienced in that lower secondary. Interesting to note that our primary, Australian primary is not too far behind, in fact. So out-of-field teaching in Australia, research there's a bit of a hotspot here internationally for research. It's been noticed for some time in our research and also on the ground. Not so much in policy though. The out-of-field teacher workforce recognised that we got state-based differences in terms of, as well as subject-related differences between early career teachers and their more experienced colleagues in terms of the proportion of out-of-field teaching. Also, there is heterogeneity in terms of the out-of-field teaching workforce, many different ways of thinking about out-of-field and experiencing it, and different factors determining out-of-fieldness, so whether teachers feel out-of-field or not. We're interested in the language of professional education. So here we're talking about upskilling programs that lead to additional qualifications, but also have a broader idea of broader notion of professional learning and development. There is inconsistency in terms of uptake and longevity of programs, and this is basically a cultural response. And it's a product of the way specialisation is recognised in Australia. So in the Australian context of out-of-field teaching, we had a summit a few years ago, and there were a number of key messages from that, but the one that we're going to deal with today in particular is around the developing policies and practices that support teachers' practice, wellbeing and professional learning. So this is our study. We are aiming to model the ecology of an education system that would shift cultural norms that currently undervalue re-specialisation of teachers through professional education. And as I say, that's particularly the case at the moment with teacher shortages. So looking at what factors influence uptake, and then thinking around what's the ecology or ecologies of an education system that values diverse pathways to teachers becoming in field. So in terms of our study, we have a literature and policy review. We're going to be reporting on the interview study, and that's leading into the national survey and a Delphi study after that. As an assumption for our research, we assume that teachers and schools are more likely to value and engage with PE and reduce incidents of out-of-field when there are defined pathways to actually becoming in field. In terms of the methodology, this particular interview study, we interviewed different people within the professional education system. We haven't really gone out into schools yet, which is why that's blank. But ultimately, we've got 37 interviews from different contexts. We did categorical and factor analysis, well, not a factor analysis, analysis that identified categories and factors. It was a qualitative thematic analysis, and we're particularly in this study looking at the interactions and contradictions inherent in the education system that signal opportunities for systemic change toward an ideal professional education ecosystem. So this is identifying those areas that might need reform and thinking around what are the mechanisms and catalysts for change. So at this point, I'm going to hand over. We've got two contradictions in particular that we're going to be looking at. One is a contradiction and looking at the assumed learning versus the access fragility, and a second one looking at individualized fragmentation and of the experience and the systemized responsibility. So I'm going to hand over to Connie now.
Thanks, Linda. So the contradiction one, well, there were many contradictions, but we're focusing on two for this presentation. The first one was associated with professional learning, professional development, or as where we're coming to understand it, professional education, which speaks to all of those things more broadly, including formalized respecialization or credential programs. So this assumption is based on the fact that professional education is the answer to upskilling teachers to teach out of field, yet access to that professional education is quite variable. So in the next 4 slides or so, I'll unpack what this means. So for assumed learning, so our analysis highlighted that an assumption that teachers are responsible for their own professional education. So the PE itself was characterized in ways that ranged from very vague to very formal. And we've organized these as levels. And you'll see on the slide, there's blue font, which is actual excerpts from our transcribed interview to give you a sense of the voices of our participants. So level 1 pointed to the vague. So there's a recognition that something is needed. And you can see how that shapes out in that particular excerpt. For level 2, we're getting more specific language here, and it's pointing to the role of on-the-job learning. And level 2 also points to a recognition that there is actually a need for disciplinary or domain-specific knowledge, or PCK, as many of us are aware of that term. And then finally, level 3, that's getting to real formalized learning. And that would support that deeper learning required to teach in another field, for example, the micro credentials. And you can see in this interview expert, the participant went on to specify actual annual time commitments for the out-of-field PE training. So the next slide talks about access fragility, which is a term that we've described sort of the ad hoc nature of how teachers can access the ad hoc nature of the PE that teachers can access. So the participants describe various factors that influence the PE uptake, and we've organized these into the following 2 levels. So system and school factors, experiences from the providers. So I'll start with the system and school factors. So this pertains to those working right in schools and then more broadly across the systems, for example, departments of education. The next slide will address the actual providers of professional education, but for now, school and system. So our analysis of the responses indicated several factors, and we've organized them into sort of these, we can call them meta themes. You'll see authorization, accessibility, and allowance. So we'll start with the theme of authorization. You can see that it speaks to 4 areas. The first being the issue of short-term teaching assignments or casual teachers. So, and this is speaking to leaders just really not prepared to support that professional learning for those that are teaching out of field in these positions. It's like, they're not going to be there. So why should we invest in this? That second area of authorization speaks to that tension between whole school approaches to PD, like we're going to be focusing on this, could be explicit teaching, an example, popular example in Australia, versus individual needs. It's like, well, now I'm teaching math for the first time. Can I get some support on that? And that sort of speaks to how leadership values professional learning. The third one, of course, brings in the idea of the role of funding. And the fourth one speaks to the impact of changes in policy requirements. So the VIT is a sort of an overarching body for the state of Victoria, which influences, how teachers will be supported in the classroom and to what extent. That the next theme I'll pick up on is allowance, and that identified factors related to time and money, that teachers need to be provisioned with the time to undertake learning and need to be remunerated accordingly. Okay, the next slide in the contradiction one is from the perspective of the providers. So this, again, the access fragility also was apparent to the providers themselves. So they struggled to get teacher uptake due to schools often prioritizing that broader professional learning over the subject-specific training. So this slide again highlights those perspectives of those who are providing the various professional education delivery options for the teachers. So the first theme speaks to awareness, the fact that that professional education is actually available, but teachers aren't aware of it. The second one, actually the next two speak to tensions between what the teacher needs and what the PE provider can actually deliver, and the tension between what the school will support. So that quote that is mentioning that teachers' needs versus school needs. STAVCon is a Science Teachers Association of Victoria. And in this quote, it points to the fact that the school actually had expertise in place to deliver a PD workshop, but the school wouldn't allow those expert teachers to deliver the workshop. Just to give some context for those that are outside Australia or Victoria. And then the providers also indicated, practical barriers, we could say, related to supply and demand. And then, of course, the funding requirement for staffs to actually attend. So we're pulling teachers out of school. We need to have funding to pay for relief teachers so the students can continue with their learning. I guess in all, for contradiction one, our analysis highlights that on one hand, PE education is the answer to out-of-field teaching, but on the other hand, access is fraught. So we have our responses indicate barriers at the level of the individual teacher, school, and at the system. So with that, I'll hand it over to Janet.
Thank you, Connie. So in thinking about the second contradiction that's emerged from our data, this contradiction is really mapping the fact that in any school sector, in any school system, there's a reasonable expectation that there would be systematized responsibility for having teachers in field. And the reality is that in our data, what we're finding, happy to move to the next slide. What we're finding in our data is that the reality is that we really actually have an individualized and very fragmented approach to teacher PL. So that's the tension that we've identified. So the data that we have from professional associations and universities and other stakeholder groups in those bodies is that out-of-field teaching professional education responsibility essentially is left to the individual. Connie mentioned the ad hoc nature, and indeed that individualized expectation is a really strong theme that's emerged in our findings. The result of this for out-of-field teachers is fragmentation. We can see fragmentation across the systems in the way that the teachers are being finding opportunities, and as Connie said, they have to find and locate that information themselves. This leads to inequitable experiences of professional learning. So it depends on whether the school makes it work, whether it doesn't, whether the teacher is an individual teacher in the school, and that this disparate and inefficient access was noted by a lot of our respondents. It's interesting to note, and a number of our respondents did, that those who are contextually responsible, that is head teachers and professional associations, for example, have no authority for responsibility for creating and disseminating out-of-field professional learning or professional education. So the people who are actually in the schools and at the forefront of working with out-of-field teachers, their authority really isn't such that they should be managing this. It should be happening at a different level. School systems and curriculum bodies who might be expected to take responsibility or in-fieldedness of teachers don't necessarily acknowledge it as a significant phenomenon. And that's something that was very, very clear when we did the review of the policy and the literature in the field, that's not, the out-of-fieldness is not really strongly present in those documents. So that's the reality. And here's some of the quotes that have come through from the data. The idea that there's a disconnect in what providers are being asked to offer versus what schools and teachers are going to find sustainable, doable, manageable, and financial to support. So that notion that there's a space somewhere that we can work together, and that disconnect is quite prominent in the data. There's still a strong theme emerging that there's a need to give teachers back their professionalism and listen to the research to address out-of-field teaching. They have to be part of the solution. Interesting, a number of our respondents did speak to the fact that there is a lot known about out-of-field teaching, but that the fact that this fragmentation still exists is antithetical to what we already know about out-of-field teaching. And the quote that to recognise teachers as experts in their field's a good start, but the idea that the responsibility of helping support teachers is part of what we can look to the solution as well. And then if we look at the other side of the contradictions, that is picking up that notion of the systematised responsibility. In her opening, Linda referenced the notion of, who's responsible. Well, that's a question that is still being debated and obviously big part of what our research. I mentioned in the first point that those who kind of do have authoritative responsibility, the leaders in the sectors, the organisations, they're not necessarily showing contextual responsibility in schools. In fact, it's almost I can't think who it was, mentioned, the hidden secret, the dirty little secret of out-of-field teaching. So it's almost a denial that it's a thing. Professional associations and in-field and initial teacher education providers are emerging as being held responsible for upskilling out-of-field teaching. But in actual fact, is that where the responsibility should it sit? I guess our respondents are suggesting that we've got to recognise first that it's a problem, and they're arguing for a connected, collaborative and integrated approach. And I think that's being echoed in the other papers that we've heard today. So that's a strong theme that's emerging, that notion of accountability and shared responsibility from our stakeholders. And still a lot of questions. How do we get people to own up to their responsibilities? Is it acceptable to expect distributed responsibility? And I guess who is accountable for the support of and quality of the teaching? And then just to finish off with a couple of other quotes on the next slide, please. Thanks, Linda. There was one of the questions that we've asked in the survey was around the ecosystem. What would it look like? What do we think it is like? And generally speaking, our respondents to our interview questions were talking about the fact we need to get collaboration. We need to get people working. Good professional development and professional associations need to be at the table. We need to have everyone sitting down and coming to a solution. There was general affirmation of the notion of an ecosystem. There's not one size fits all. You've got to have different circumstances and different styles, and that there's perhaps needs to be a warming of relations between schools and universities and government so that we can all find a role in finding ways to make it better. And the responsibility for supporting out-of-field teachers in our jurisdictions often finds itself being placed on professional associations, and maybe into ITE providers who are providing professional education rather than it being shared across the education system. And I think there's a recognition that is not allowing a systematized approach to emerge. So I think that would be our contradiction.
Thanks very much, Janet. So just to sum it up then, we've got the contradictions highlight areas that perhaps need reform. So the assumption that teachers need PD and that teachers are responsible for their own learning, that's where we begin. And then understanding that the problem is that the PD can be difficult to access because of school factors, and PD providers get frustrated by the lack of uptake. Teachers' varying needs are meant to be dealt with in a system of professional learning, but it's fragmented and there's equity in terms of who gets what support. So some schools provide more supportive environments than other schools. Some subjects have more PD available than other subjects. Some regions are more adequately provisioned, for example. So at the same time, the reality is that PE may not be available, be accessible due to various school system barriers, nor cater for diverse teaching needs. So while there is a call for connected, collaborative and integrated approaches to PE with clear accountability and shared responsibility for stakeholders, provision does not automatically translate to uptake because of the various factors influencing accessibility and fragmentation in individual teacher needs. So thinking around what mechanisms for change might be available, what catalyst can spark or drive reform, we're thinking around those three areas of accessibility, fragmentation and responsibility. We can think, bits and pieces coming up. We can acknowledge the heterogeneity of impacts of out-of-field teaching. That's where we need to start. So who teaches out of field and why and under what conditions? That shows that there's diversity in that. And that therefore complicates any efforts to mandate consistent support structures. The second one is around the PE ecosystem and that it really must differ or offer both diverse and flexible pathways. We need to acknowledge the likelihood that new teachers will teach out of field, and then how do we support them in initial teacher education to be ready or at least aware that that might happen? How do we normalise the updating of specialisation once teachers are in school? Because ultimately retraining can be undervalued for the various reasons that we've mentioned. Looking at options of concentrated professional development activities as well as formal respecialisation programs for teachers, and thinking around programs that recognise the different school and leadership contexts that teachers are in. The last point or mechanism that we might look at is fostering relationships across the sectors in response to that systematized responsibility, such as looking at the ongoing relationships between university and school beyond initial teacher education. That pretty much stops in Australia, for example. So breaking down the barriers to come back to the ITE provider for support, thinking around how we can do that. And ultimately down the bottom there, you've got schools, subject associations, universities, government, school sectors, and PD providers who all need to work together in this ideal ecosystem that we might be looking towards modelling, I suppose, through this project. So that will be our next step. We'll be looking at and doing the national survey and pulling some of these ideas in it to see what sort of mechanisms or what are the most important things within the system to sort of look at it as our next steps. So that's it for us. So thanks very much.